And I also more and more strongly believe that Trump understands what the game is and that he's on the right side of history, because somebody who is in the know, it was Susan Kokindo of the Promethean Action Committee, who is very politically active, but she told me that in a recent cabinet meeting about all these Middle Eastern events in Washington, that Trump on several occasions during the meeting made a point of calling America's enemies, Iran, Russia, China. He said, our enemies. And he also called them the people that are perceived to be our enemies. That's a very strange way to formulate, what you mean to say. But it's very clear that he's not buying that Iran is an enemy to the United States, that Russia is an enemy to the United States, that China is an enemy. He understands who the real enemy is. And so that's all bad news for the undead British Empire, because now they have very powerful constellation of regional powers arrayed against them, and they know what the game is. And the whole British thing depends on people with very thin hold on power. UAE is important as a new Middle Eastern financial center. Qatar is important as a new, let's call it, intelligence special forces headquarters for the Western Empire. Damascus is now important, but what? Damascus is ruled by a foreigner imposed by the Turks and the British. So anyway, this is where it comes from. These are the vestiges of the British imperial system. London is still very much keen on perpetuating all that and activating their networks in Turkey, HTS, taking over Damascus. Vanessa Billy, who is now in Lebanon, but she used to be a correspondent from Damascus, she said that every 4-star hotel in Damascus is packed with British agents, with whether it be NGOs or private contractors or flat out foreign office personnel, but British are crawling all over Damascus now. And the good news is that the Russians understand what the game is, the Iranians understand what the game is. In a very strange turn of event, the Iranians, after yesterday's bombardment of Damascus by the Israelis, the Iranians reached out to al-Jilani and offered cooperation, which is very interesting. Again, an indication they absolutely understand what the game is and who the real enemy is. And the Chinese understand the game. It seems to me that Turkey, particularly Erdogan and the Turkish deep state and intelligence apparatus, is on board with the British foreign policy, contributing to the destabilization of the region. And so we know now that the Turks have collaborated with the British MI6 and the British foreign policy establishment in cultivating the Al-Nusra Front. They created together the HTS militia, and they cultivated Jolani and Al-Shibani and a whole bunch of these jihadis. They rebranded them as reformers, as New Democratic Front in Syria and so forth. And they have presented them to the world as such. We know that the Turks have been handling the HTS from the strategic military aspect, but the public relations side has been handled by the British. Now, how does this come about? There's a part of the political class in Turkey which see in all this an opportunity to re-establish some form of an Ottoman Empire, right? And many of them believe that Aleppo and parts of Syria and Lebanon actually should belong to Turkey. It should be rightfully a Turkish territory. And this, let's call it, this ambition has been exploited by the British to co-opt Turkey into their orbit, into their geopolitical concept. If they resolve the electromagnetic radiation inside the car, I might even get interested in an electric car at that stage. And the current head of the MI6, Sir Richard Moore, has been one of the main proponents of this concept of Great Turania, right? The Great Turania would be some kind of a political union of the Turkic people across the Central Asia, because you have these Turkic peoples that it goes from Turkey across to Azerbaijan, and then you have Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, all the way to China. These are all Turkic people, right? And they share a common language and a common culture and so forth. And for Erdogan, as his political legacy, it would be appealing to emerge as a great uniter of the Turkic people and creating this. If this entity stretches across the bulk of the Eurasian continent, that's a very powerful position to be in, because this is where China's One Belt, One Road initiative has many of its transport routes that are extremely important for China's strategic plans and the Russians. And the international north-south transport corridor, which goes from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Baltic Sea, that one would cut across this greater Turania. So it's a very good way for the British, for the Western Empire, to derail Chinese and Russian and BRICS, the whole BRICS approach to the international development. And Iran is absolutely the central pivot point in that whole concept. And then when people were trying to suggest that it's actually Iran's fault, and he said, yeah, but he was actually putting the weight of his criticism on Israel. And then we also know that Benjamin Netanyahu went to the United States for, I don't know if he's still there, but he's been there for a few days. And they had many meetings. And some of these meetings didn't go well. And we know that at least on one occasion, Donald Trump stormed out of the meeting with Netanyahu. There was no joint press conference after that. So we don't know what happened, but it doesn't seem that the relationship is easy. And from everything I gather, it seems to me that Trump is very serious about getting both Iran and Israel to stand down and to stop attacking one another. It seems to me that he's really keen on making sure that the relationship, that the region stays at peace. This we've known for the last month, since the 12-day war ended. But we've also, on one of our previous podcasts, we've talked about Syria, that it will be relatively easy, and I mentioned the British hand in Syria, that it will be relatively easy for the British to get something going in Syria, to use Syria to again cause an arson attack against peace in the region. And now I think we see that that's not going to go very far. Israel is important, but Israel is in its dying agony. And then they have a government in Lebanon that doesn't really have the support of the people. And Hezbollah is still strong, refuses to disarm, and does have the support of the people. So I think that all of this stuff that this little cabal in London is doing with the ruling families of UAE and Qatar and the deep state of Turkey and these jihadis in Damascus, I don't think that will actually be sustainable for the long term. And I think that ultimately they will fail. By the way, we're going to take it upon ourselves. We're going to negotiate some kind of a peaceful settlement, because we're all about diplomacy and sitting at the table and talk. But it's always the same instigator. And before, when you asked me the question of their cooperation with Qatar, because Qatar, thanks to their relationship with the British, has been one of the, or if not the main financier to all these jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and Khorasan and all of these splinter groups that emerged in the Middle East of these violent extremist jihadi fanatics. And so there's a researcher called Karine Borgian, and she's an expert Orientalist, right? And here's a direct quote from her. Britain is trying to take the helm of world domination from the United States. One of their tools is control of virtually all radical Islamist movements in the world. It's not just me saying it. It's, if you scratch below the surface and you really look into what's going on and who's stirring the pot in the region, you always come up with the British. So Russia, let's say if there was a regime change in Iran, and if the West managed to impose the Shah, and the Shah then realigned Iran with Israel, with the West, that would be the end of the international north-south transport corridor, which is very strategically important for Russia. And as Kemi Badenoch gave away in one of her recent interviews in Britain. She said that Israel is fighting a proxy war on the behalf of the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom does not have interest in there being peace in the region. Their interest is to keep the region destabilized and to eventually bring about the regime change in Iran. Trump said explicitly that he's not looking to do a regime change in Iran. The British are saying that they want a regime change in Iran. We saw just this week a statement from Lord, what is his name? I have to look it up. Lord Beamish, who went and gave a whole statement about why Iran is a great threat to the British, to Great Britain, to the British people, and to British interests. And so it's always that side that is stirring the pot in the Middle East, as they do elsewhere, as they do in the Ukraine, as they're preparing to do in the Balkans. And I think that Trump is actually trying to do something completely different. And I think that if you know what happened and how it happened, it's absolutely clear that October 7th was a false flag attack, that it was orchestrated to happen that way, that its purpose was to result in a large number of civilian casualties in order to galvanize the Israeli society for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and also the West Bank. And this is what we have today. It didn't happen randomly. It was done to happen that way. And then we also have to always remember that one of the people who has been deeply involved in all things Middle East, because the British imperative is to not only defend their hegemony in the region, but to bring it to the level they had during their colonial days of the 19th century, before World War I. And so one of the key linchpins of all of this has been Tony Blair, back in the shadows. He's not in the news. He's not out making statements about al-Jolani, about Iran, but you can see that he's involved. And his former chief of staff, Jonathan Powell, is deeply involved in networking with the jihadi groups that have now overtaken Syria, and also rebranding them so that to the Western public they seem very reasonable. If you go to Davos meet this year in 2025, Tony Blair actually interviewed Assad al-Shibani, the current foreign minister of Syria, and they're a terrible irritant to the Saudis themselves. Like the Saudis hate the Qataris, and they're not taking action now, but it could easily happen that the circumstances in the region say that Mohammed bin Salman and the Iranian leadership say, okay, let's clean this up, and then there's no more Qatar very easily. Who's going to defend them? Nobody's going to be able to defend them. It's very hard to judge from what we know, but I see that the relationship is not, it doesn't seem to me friendly on Trump's side. It doesn't seem friendly from Netanyahu's side either. Netanyahu is desperate. He absolutely needs the American support, because no American support, it means the end of Israel very quickly. And so he desperately needs the American support, and he's maneuvering to make sure that he doesn't lose that support. On the other hand, Trump cannot show himself to be hostile to Israel, even though from Trump we had different signals. Remember when Jeffrey Sachs a few months ago had a video on X where he said that Benjamin Netanyahu is a deep, dark son of a bitch, and then more. And then Trump reposted this in one of his posts. And we saw that when Trump went and made a tour of the Middle East, he skipped Israel. He didn't go there. And he has expressed sharp criticism of Israel for their bombing of Iran, which is unique in American political life, because normally everybody has a knee-jerk reaction. Whatever Israel does, Israel has the right to defend herself. That's the only thing you're ever going to hear. So the fact that Trump was saying that he's not very happy with them, he interviewed him in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and al-Shibani gave all these answers that you thought, oh, this is a really nice young man, such reasonable answers. They want democracy. They want to empower women. I swear this was part of the discussion. They want freedom and prosperity for the Syrian people and peace and stability in the region. Who wouldn't want to take this guy home and introduce him to his daughters? Wonderful, just wonderful. But what you saw actually is exactly this public relations stunt, so that everybody thinks, oh, now we're rid of that evil Bashar al-Assad and these really nice people are there. And look, Tony Blair is interviewing him and we can all see how really nice he is. That's part of the whole mix, because probably the most important audience for all this is actually the Western public, because we are the ones that have to acquiesce, that we have to consent to the new redrawing of the Middle Eastern map and to regime change Iran and to bring the Shah, which the British and the Israelis have been coddling and cultivating as the next leader. And Qatar in this whole equation is the important, how do you call it? It's like intelligence, diplomacy, special forces headquarters for the region. But the problem is that Qatar is a little nothing. It can be wiped out easily. And they're a terrible irritant to the Iranians. If you keep parties at war nonstop, and you're the one with the monopoly on financial capital and on credit, you have the global monopoly on advanced high-tech weaponry and other types of technology for communications, for oil drilling, pipelines, all the technologies that are necessary for industrial development and production of energy and transport and so on. Then if you keep everybody at war against the other, you keep them from developing, but you also make them dependent on you for money, because once you go to war, first thing you need is going to be credit. And then immediately you're going to have to spend a lot of that credit, if not all of it, on weaponry, which again, you're going to be buying from BAE Systems and so forth, which are one of the major arms merchants in the Middle East. So this divide and conquer, constant flaming of the war escalations is coming ultimately from London and then also from Paris. And we still have their military and naval presence of French ships, American ships, British ships. But the difference now is that Trump is trying to extricate the United States from that region. And I know that it doesn't seem that way, because a lot of people are interpreting Trump's action quite as the opposite. But the more I'm observing events and politics in the United States itself, the more I'm convinced. And they think that all the spending is just to give a lot of money to Trump's friends and cronies. No, it's to facilitate something similar to FDR's New Deal, to bring the United States back into being an industrial powerhouse, a research and development powerhouse, and to foster new innovation and research and development so that the United States can catch up, compete against China and other nations, because it's not just that. Iran is producing a lot of engineering talent and new scientific and technological advances, and so are the Russians, and so are the Indians. So it's no longer where the West has the primacy and monopoly on advanced technology and everybody else is just exporting raw materials and living in poverty, having to buy technologies from the West. So the world has changed, and there's absolutely no doubt that Trump and his people in his administration perfectly understand this. But my understanding is that Chinese have really advanced the battery technology to the extent that even somebody like me, I'm the farthest away you can get from EV enthusiasts. If you have a battery that runs for 2,000 or 3,000 cycles, which can charge in 5 minutes and which has autonomy of 1,000 kilometers, even I start to think that's interesting. We have to place the United Kingdom at the very top of the list of suspects, because we talked about this before, but in 2019, it was the British who tried very hard to persuade Donald Trump into launching an attack against Iran. It was after the downing of the Reaper, I think, or one of those big drones that the Americans fly over the Straits of Hormuz. The Iranians downed it, and then there was this big lobbying effort to try to persuade Trump into starting a war basically against Iran. And he said no. And then there was this hysterical exchange of messages between the British embassy and the Foreign Office, berating Trump, criticizing him, calling him names because he refused to start war against Iran. But it was the British who wanted that war to happen and who mounted this whole diplomatic front against Trump to persuade him to do it. So it's been them all along, nonstop, always mixed in, but always acting behind the scene because they want the Americans to do the dirty work. And then when the Americans do the dirty work, then British often emerge and they pretend to be very critical of the Americans because of the use of force, and they shouldn't do this, and it's terrible and it's ugly. But we're here to help things, and we're going to bring peace and stability, and we're going to lead the negotiations.